Again, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Jessie Anderson. I sit in USAID's Center for Resilience as our Senior Conflict Advisor, and I'm really looking forward to this event today. So I will go over a couple housekeeping points for us, and to do that, we can head to the next slide. This is something that we've done in this series so far and that I find to be super interesting. So this event will be conducted in both English and French. So make sure you choose your preferred language, either English or French, by clicking that globe icon that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now, once you click on the interpretation globe, you'll be able to select your language, and you can mute the original audio or follow it at a lower volume. It might be easier to mute the original audio. So if you have any problems accessing the interpretation or any other tech issues, please reach out in the chat to anyone with REAL in their name for support. And because I know I'm speaking in English, we're putting a link in the chat to access the French version too. Perfect, and we can head to the next slide. So I'll quickly note that this event is organized by the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning, or REAL Award, which is a consortium-led effort funded by the USAID Center for Resilience, and it is implemented by Save the Children, Food for the Hungry, Mercy Corps, and Tango International. And I will give a quick high-level overview of our agenda today. So the reason we're here together is to discuss key takeaways from the Rapid Learning Series brief on social cohesion and its role in peace and resilience. And to do that, we will kick off with a presentation from Mercy Corps' Ryan Sheely. After that, we head into a moderated panel with our presenter, as well as additional Mercy Corps colleagues based in Niger and the United States. And then finally, we open this up to Q&A from you all. So before we start, we are going to share a quick poll with everyone just to kind of get a quick pulse check of where we're at when we're thinking about social cohesion. You should see this on the screen now. So select the option that best describes you. I understand how to build social cohesion in conflict settings. You could be in the no, this is new to me bucket, more of a somewhat but want to learn more, or yes, I feel fairly confident here. And we will give folks a minute or two to fill that out, and then we will report out super quickly. So we have our results, and it looks like most folks are in the somewhat but want to learn more bucket. 55% of folks were there. And we have 24% who say, yes, I feel fairly confident. So it'll be really great to hear from you in the Q&A as well. And then we've got about 21% saying, no, this is new to me. Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for playing along with the poll. And with that, and to kick us off, I'm very excited to welcome Mercy Corps' Ryan Sheely, who is the Director of Research for Conflict and Governance. I know I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I really enjoy this research. So Ryan, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jessie. And thank you all for coming to hear us speak for an hour and a half about social cohesion. So I want to start off by making sure that we're on the same page about what we mean when we're talking about social cohesion, because it'll be a very long session for everyone otherwise. So what's been helpful to Mercy Corps is to think about social cohesion as a set of values, identities, attitudes, and behaviors that shape how a given society holds together. Building on this idea, our working definition is that social cohesion is a sense of trust, shared purpose, and a willingness to engage and cooperate among different individuals, groups, institutions in a given area. Despite the growing body of evidence about the relationship between social cohesion and its contribution to resilience and peace, there are still major gaps in theory and evidence on local level variation in social cohesion. Filling these evidence gaps will help ensure that humanitarian and development assistance can be more effectively leveraged to build social cohesion and therefore promote peace and resilience. In this presentation, I'll summarize the key findings from a research brief that uses baseline data from a USAID funded program called PEACE, which operated in the Tillabéri region of Niger. The research that I'm presenting today was co-authored by a team of Mercy Corps colleagues, Adam Lichtenheld, Laurel Morrison, Lisa Inks, and Emily Tancora. The Tillabéri region of Niger is an epicenter of multiple types of ongoing conflict drivers. A large socioeconomic crisis, environmental impacts restricting the availability and quality of land and water, disagreements between pastoralists and agriculturalists that contribute to inter-ethnic grievances and banditry, and increased insecurity resulting from a spillover of conflict, including violent extremism from neighboring Mali. Each of these types of conflict drivers have connections to a shared set of underlying structural challenges in the region, including poor service delivery and weak state presence. Violent extremist organizations capitalize on deepened social cleavages to increase recruitment, completing a vicious cycle through which increased violence further limits access to resources, erodes resilience by decreasing livelihood capacities, and deepens food insecurity, which in turn further intensifies these conflict drivers. This set of dynamics informs Mercy Corps' peace building programming in Tillabéri, where we implemented a program called Peace from 2019 until wrapping up in October 2021. The core idea behind the Peace program's theory of change is that if communities meaningfully participate in the design of joint projects across social divisions, then social cohesion will be strengthened and community vulnerability to recruitment by violent extremist organizations will be reduced. This theory of change builds on research that Mercy Corps conducted through an earlier USAID-funded program. This program, which was called VRE, focused on designing a village selection tool that enables practitioners to identify communities most vulnerable to recruitment by violent extremist organizations. A core substantive finding of this research was that the presence of intercommunal dialogue and social cohesion were key factors that reduced community-level vulnerability to violent extremism. Peace built directly on this earlier program by using the village selection tool from VRE to select a set of 40 villages within 3 departments in Tillabéri that were most vulnerable to violent extremist recruitment. Within these villages, the program team used Mercy Corps' community mobilization toolkit, which is called Catalyze, to facilitate an inclusive process, bringing all groups within a community together to work together to design, implement, and monitor community projects that were intended to build social cohesion. Peace also integrated rigorous research and learning into the entire program lifecycle to help tailor and refine the programming approach, test the assumptions and hypotheses underpinning the theory of change, and to contribute to the broader body of knowledge and practice. To achieve these goals, the Peace program articulated a research agenda made up of 3 broad questions. Today's presentation and discussion focuses on the first research question regarding describing and explaining local variation in social cohesion. The other 2 research questions are summarized in other reports, one of which was published in March 2021, and the one on research question 3, which is forthcoming in early 2022. These findings side of my presentation, but where relevant, my co-panelists and I will draw on and preview this broader learning. So to answer this research question, we use baseline survey data from the program, in which 12 to 15 individuals were sampled in each of 40 villages where the program operates, for a total sample of 575 respondents. The sample size for some questions is lower due to differences in response rates across questions. The survey included 6 questions that measured a number of underlying aspects of social cohesion: trust, interaction between groups, tolerance, collective action, social inclusion, and cooperation. The wording is summarized here on this. The survey also collected data on a number of other contextual factors, including governance, participation of women and youth in conflict management, governance and peace building, and patterns of peace and security within the community. To answer the core research question within this brief, we analyze this data in two ways. The primary mode of analysis is a set of individual level regressions with the social cohesion questions as the dependent variables and the individual level characteristics or contextual variables as explanatory variables. It's important to highlight an important limitation of this approach, which is that relationships described here are correlational. So when we do find relationships between aspects of social cohesion and contextual factors, we can't assess the direction of causality. And I'll make sure to highlight those elements of uncertainty throughout the presentation of results. To analyze the extent and nature of village level variation in social cohesion, we calculated village level aggregate scores for each question by calculating the percentage of respondents in the village answering yes or agree to that question, and by calculating Asian index score, that is the village level average across all 6 survey questions. So I'll now walk you through the central results in the brief, going one by one through 4 sub-questions. So the first thing we want to look at is, what does taking this multidimensional approach to measuring social cohesion tell us about context in Tilbury? In general, respondents reported high levels of collective action, cooperation, and social inclusion, but low levels of trust. To help illustrate this finding, here's a visualization of the average village level patterns across each of the social cohesion questions. So on this graph, each axis corresponds to one of the 6 dimensions that we measured, and the concentric circles correspond to the average percentage of respondents answering yes to that question across the full sample of 40 villages in our sample. So what really jumps out here is what I just mentioned. Trust is the overwhelming weak point, followed by quality of interactions, which is the second lowest. Surprisingly, at least to us on the research and program team, on average, the other 4 dimensions are relatively high. They're all over 60% of people saying yes, and collective action and cooperation are over 80%. In addition to mapping the general patterns across dimensions, we also use the individual level regression analyses to examine the relationships between dimensions. While there's no clear link between cooperation, collective action, and trust, respondents who reported experiencing positive interactions with other group members were more likely to be trusting and tolerant of these groups. So these findings show the importance of putting positive interactions front and center in the design and implementation of social cohesion programming, especially in contexts where trust is one of the weaker points. In the context of peace, when adapting Mercy Corps' Catalyze Community Mobilization Toolkit, the program team emphasized positive interactions and trust building through careful facilitation of initial meetings and emphasizing inclusion during the planning process by meeting with a broad cross-section of the community and allowing all groups an opportunity to speak and be heard. In addition, Catalyze is an iterative planning process, meaning that it builds multiple opportunities for planning and implementation of projects, which helps to sustain positive interactions and deepen trust over time. So after looking at the average patterns across the 6 dimensions of social cohesion within the whole data set, the next question is about how much these patterns vary from village to village and what this means for program design. As the results to the previous question indicate, trust was universally low across the whole sample. In fact, every single one of the 40 villages in the sample, trust had the lowest score or was tied for the lowest score across all 6 social cohesion questions. However, even on this weakest question, there was variation across villages, ranging from several where 25% of respondents answered yes to the intergroup trust question, to the majority of others where none of the sampled individuals answered yes to that question. Looking across the other dimensions, the variation is even greater. For quality of interactions, tolerance, and social inclusion, the range of patterns in responses that is 100%. So that is, there are some villages where all respondents answered yes to that question, and some where no one answered yes. There's also substantial variation across village in terms of which dimensions are second lowest after trust and which dimensions are the highest. Again, it's helpful to look at these patterns graphically to help understand this finding and why it is important. So what you see here is the same style of graph that we were looking at earlier. And the upper left-hand corner is that same average score graph that we were looking at on the previous slide. The other three graphs are the scores for three different villages, which are all in the same administrative department within Tillaberi. So what's interesting about this is that when you look at the aggregate scores for each village, they're all relatively similar. They're all slightly under the average for the whole sample, and they're all within about 5 percentage points of each other. However, when you drill into the patterns village by village, it tells a somewhat different story. In each of these three villages, there are differences in the level of intergroup trust, as well as differences in what dimensions are the second lowest and highest. So in Dole, in the upper right-hand corner, the second lowest dimension is cooperation. In Pambuje, in the lower right-hand corner, right below it, social inclusion is the second lowest dimension. These differences matter in practice because the body of evidence and practice on social cohesion and violent conflict is starting to indicate that different dimensions of social cohesion are connected to different types of conflict drivers and are best addressed by different kinds of community projects. For example, the community in Dole, in the upper right-hand corner, focused in on trust and cooperation in the joint projects that it designed, implementing a grain mill and land forum alongside conflict management and mediation training to help improve cooperation over the use of natural resources and infrastructure. In contrast, the community in Pambuje, the village in the lower right-hand corner, honed in on weaknesses of social inclusion of women in the joint projects that it designed, emphasizing training women in leadership and incorporating them in intergroup dialogues and mediation alongside investments in local infrastructure. The takeaway from this finding is that programs designed to strengthen social cohesion need the ability to measure and identify how components of social cohesion differ across contexts, and the flexibility to design and target interventions accordingly. As I've discussed, the PEACE program incorporated both of these elements. Having data from the baseline that describes the variation in relative strengths and weaknesses across social cohesion dimensions enabled the program team and communities to engage in a more detailed process of diagnosis and design than would have been possible if using a single social cohesion score. PEACE's core intervention model also allowed the kind of flexibility and adaptation needed to tailor village projects to these kinds of more fine-grained diagnoses. The PEACE program's adaptation of the Catalyze toolkit contained a set of 7 types of community projects that strengthen different dimensions of social cohesion, along with an indicative theory of change and sample projects. The program team used the data from the baseline survey, along with these program examples, in the participatory planning sessions to work with the communities to design a set of projects and activities that responded to that community's specific needs. The next set of questions and findings move from a focus on describing variation across social cohesion dimensions and across villages to starting to explain how other factors might shape these patterns of social cohesion. The first focuses on specific dimensions of social identity, specifically gender, and how that shapes behaviors, values, and attitudes related to social cohesion. For this question, what we found is that women generally reported higher levels of tolerance and collective action with other groups, as they were more willing to work on an activity of common interest with them. However, they were less likely than men to be in the habit of providing input into community decision-making. This indicates that barriers to community engagement for women hinder some aspects of social cohesion, and that social norms surrounding gender can generate different outcomes for social cohesion between men and women. The practical takeaway of this finding is that examining how dimensions of social cohesion differ across groups in society is therefore crucial, as is ensuring that strategies to increase social cohesion address gender gaps. Programs should seek to address disparities in participation between women and men when designing and implementing interventions to increase social cohesion, focusing on elevating women's inclusion in decision-making processes. The final sub-question focuses on how individual perceptions of other governance and social factors shape variation in the core attitudes and behaviors that make up social cohesion. For this question, we have three distinct sets of findings and implications that we want to highlight. First, individuals who reported access to more services, including water, education, healthcare, and security, also tended to report providing greater input in community decision-making. It's unclear, however, whether access to services spurs greater civic participation or whether those who are more engaged in their communities tend to receive more services. However, we also find that access to specific services had little association with intergroup trust, tolerance, and cooperation. What this finding tells us is that better service delivery is closely tied to opportunities and motivation for greater community engagement, but may be insufficient to improve other aspects of social cohesion. This finding connects to broader research literatures on community-driven development and state legitimacy, which finds that better service delivery on its own will not necessarily improve social cohesion. This underlines the importance of intensive community mobilization approaches, such as Catalyze, for facilitating opportunities for positive interactions and increasing inclusion in decision-making around infrastructure projects. Our next finding related to research question 4 suggests that the existence of conflict management mechanisms in the community encourage community participation and empower individuals to provide their opinions in community decision-making. While the existence of these mechanisms is associated with higher perceived levels of social inclusion, they're also associated with decreased trust and less positive interactions with other groups. Again, this is a finding that trust with other groups, management mechanisms are more likely to be needed. Qualitative findings from the baseline suggest that another explanation could be that many conflict management mechanisms are managed by the village chief, who may or may not be seen as legitimate or neutral to all identity groups in a geographic area. Programs that seek to establish or strengthen conflict management mechanisms should take pains to ensure conflict sensitivity and analyze perceptions of local leaders' legitimacy to inform participant selection and program design. More research on the relationship between social cohesion and conflict management mechanisms will help to fine-tune both types of interventions and to understand how they relate to one another. The last finding that we want to highlight is that greater trust in government and community institutions had little bearing on measures of social cohesion between groups. This finding suggests that strengthening the vertical dimension of social cohesion between state and society may not be sufficient to improve horizontal cohesion between different groups, and vice versa. However, improving vertical cohesion may still be important for preventing conflict and violence in its own right. In our second brief using data from the Peace program, we find that greater confidence in state security forces was associated with less support for violence, even after controlling for local level military presence. What this means is that there's a need to think carefully about how we sequence and layer interventions that focus on the intergroup social cohesion with governance interventions that aim to build trust and shared purpose between communities and the leaders or institutions that serve them. So, to briefly sum up before handing over to my colleagues for the panel discussion and over to all of you for the Q&A, what we found in this brief that there can indeed be substantial local variation in the underlying components of social cohesion, and that this variation interacts in important ways with individuals' experiences related to gender, governance, and conflict management. As I've described throughout the presentation, this set of research findings led the Peace program to design a programming approach to building social cohesion that was simultaneously inclusive, flexible, targeted, layered, and evidence-driven. In particular, the program's adaptation of the Mercy Corps Catalyze approach simultaneously enabled it to design a well-facilitated process that helped to promote positive interactions and build trust, while creating flexibility that allowed communities to design and implement targeted projects that address the most pressing dimensions of social cohesion within their communities. The next steps from this research involve continuing to learn from peace while working to extend and test the generalizability of these lessons and recommendations in other contexts. As I mentioned, the biggest piece of this will be the third short report from the Peace Research Agenda, which examines how this intervention shapes social cohesion and support for violence. We're expecting to release that study in early 2022, as I said. I'm now going to hand it over to my colleagues to talk about some of the broader extensions and implications of the peace research beyond peace and beyond Niger. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you so much for that. That was, you packed so much in and it was so concise and it kind of has my mind worrying, which is super exciting heading into this panel. You know, I had a couple of reflections coming from USAID on this before we dive in. And, you know, one, I'm just very grateful for the topic because I think we just commonly know social cohesion really matters, but sometimes we can get stuck there. And I think there's a lot of questions about, you know, well, how exactly does this work and what does that look like? How does it vary across contexts? And this presentation just really did all of that. And then the follow-on that I know your research is also doing is then, and then what does that mean for programming? And you've given us some excellent nuggets on that. I mean, I feel like I heard loud and clear about the importance of variation across these different features to social cohesion, variation across groups, what are those linkages to other institutions, just all of that matters so much. And I know we'll get to dive into this a bit in the moderated panel. So I will, I'll stop talking and get to all of these great folks. So you can see our wonderful speakers on this slide here, but I will just introduce them quickly. So joining us for our moderated panel, we have Lisa Inks, Director of Peace and Conflict on the Technical Support Team with Mercy Corps. Then we have Ife Olawole, Quantitative Research Specialist for Peace, Conflict, and Governance. And then Siaka Malago, Director of Programs for Mercy Corps in Niger and Burkina Faso. So we will, and I'll just do a couple more housekeeping points too. So we're going to have our moderated panel for a while, which I think will be really fun, but then we'll be heading into Q&A with all of you. So please think about your questions. If you already have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand in advance. You are absolutely free to either write your question in the chat or kind of raise your hand if you'd like to engage with our panelists as well. So just noting that. And with that, I'm going to start asking these folks some questions. And I'm going to look to Siaka first to kind of ground this in the Niger experience. So I'm curious, Siaka, you know, when you look at Niger and your work in the Sahel more broadly, why is building social cohesion so important? You know, how do you see this fitting into the other kinds of development outcomes and programming goals that your team is working towards in the region? Thanks, and over to you. Oh, Siaka, I think you're on mute.
Yes, okay. Sorry for that. Okay, so as you know, I was saying that the situation in Niger and also in the Sahel more broadly is characterized by what we know the traditional effects of climate change, more and more frequent and also severe. I'm just referring to floods, drought, and heavy winds. So that lead every year to millions of people affected. We have also the conflict around the natural resource management. You know, I'm just focusing on land tenure due to the important population growth. We've in this Sahel, 80% of the population is less than 35-year-old. That means that we have a great number of youth, young people in this Sahel who are in fact interested in using these natural resources. But the kind of traditional management of these natural resources created some conflict. And also that have been a little bit not noticed in the presentation of Ryan, the fact that the cultural practices and also values are no longer promoted in the communities. So young people, they have a less feeling of belonging and also appropriation in their communities. And all these aspects, has contributed to this increased insecurity, which is leading right now in the Sahel to millions of internally displaced persons, refugees, adding a kind of additional layer of vulnerability and compromising the established development strategy that we know. And this expansion of violent extremism action within communities had fragilized the mutual trust. I think that during the presentation of Ryan on social cohesion, so he mentioned really very clearly that trust and interactions, collective action, and also some tolerances, they are in fact contributing to social cohesion. So with this expansion of violent extremism actions within the communities, this trust has been fragilized and creating an environment of permanent threat, impacting the living together of population who were peacefully interacting for centuries. That is something that we notice. And then in this in such a hostile environment, building social cohesion on both sides, horizontal social cohesion, meaning that within the ethnical groups, within all these sensitive groups in the community, and also vertical social cohesion, meaning that between the communities and also the state representatives. So this appears as, in fact, the first action while responding to immediate humanitarian assistance to establish a minimum of mutual trust, confidence, in order to be able to mobilize communities progressively around transition, recovery activities, and then development action using obviously innovative approach like the community acceptance, participatory methods, and also layering, sequencing, and also integrating with development activities. So through this piece of program, so we have noticed that as Mexico, that just for instance, cultural activities, cultural events remain a great ingredient for building both horizontal and vertical social cohesion, bridging humanitarian assistance and development activities in a perfect vision of nexus in which Mexico is engaged as imposed by this current context of Niger and the Central Sahel broadly. So meaning that our vision right now is in fact to scale up, to try in fact to consolidate these fundings from the peace program, in order to include them in all our programs that we are designing, and also the current program that we are also implementing. Thank you.
Siaka, thanks so much for that. And I have a couple more questions for you too, but I'm going to kind of go through the lineup that we have. So my next question is for Ife, and I'm wondering if you can kind of take us to a bit more of a global perspective. So I know Ryan mentioned, these different features to social cohesion, trust, collective action, et cetera. I'm curious how you see these different features influencing violence, and then how they relate to each other in places outside of Niger. Are you seeing something different in other contexts? So yeah, thanks for giving us that perspective, and over to you.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, so actually, we shouldn't automatically assume that some of these dimensions or components of social cohesion actually overlap with one another. And as Ryan, mentioned, social cohesion is this composite of several different values and different identities and attitudes and behaviors. And we should take that into consideration when planning programs and policies, and especially considering which component or which composite should be prioritized and how they affect conflict and violence. So for instance, Mercy Corps' approach to social cohesion programming identifies these different dimensions that include trust, belonging, as you mentioned, shared identity, attitudes towards outgroups, collective action norms and civic engagement. And some of the implication of that is that they have varying strengths and weaknesses within communities and societies. And a very good example is that of Nigeria, which Ryan touched on, where there are weak relationships between dimensions of social cohesion, like trust, cooperation, and collective action. But in addition to that, in our research that analyzes survey data from multiple African countries, we examine relationships between these components, and we found that they are not strongly correlated with each other. And they also don't neatly load up to one single measure of social cohesion. And even though, yeah, this finding is specific to the data set from Afrobarometer, we should also still remember and keep in mind that this is a data set that is pretty representative, and we can generally infer that it is the case even more generally too. And apart from not always overlapping with one another, I think it's also important to keep in mind that these different underlying components of social cohesion may have very different effect on violence and peace. Where again, as with the peace program in Niger, in the analysis of the baseline data, we see these components like trust and cooperation and interactions. We see that they influence violent behavior differently. It's again similar to our findings with the aggregate data across Africa, where some aspects of social cohesion are more associated with violent attitudes than other aspects of social cohesion. And so this is also important to keep in mind because, again, it buttresses Ryan's point about the need for projects to be tailored to local variations, seen as different dimensions are connected to conflict drivers and violent behavior quite differently.
That's so interesting. I'm wondering if I can follow up. Are there certain features you'd want to share that do tend to influence violence more than others? Or is it not quite clear, but we just know there's variation?
It's actually quite clear depending on the data set and depending on some of the specific context, as we alluded to earlier. But if I were to give an example, for instance, from the Afrobarometer or the data analyzing multiple countries in Africa, we would see that components of social cohesion, like identity, for instance, have very varying influence on violent behavior. We're identifying with your ethnic identity, for instance, or to speak more generally, some subnational identities may be more associated with violent attitudes than, say, identifying rather with your national identity. Again, we also see that components like trust, particularly trust in elected leaders and trust in leaders really, and trust in institutions are also more associated with violent attitudes and violent behavior, whereas we have some more nuanced findings when it comes to civic engagement. And also when we talk about like different effects of different aspects of social cohesion, it may not necessarily be that some aspects just have no effect and some aspects have effect. It may be that some aspects have stronger associations with violent attitudes than others.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's super helpful. Thank you, Ife. And so I'm going to turn to Lisa next to kind of help put this in context even further, kind of in the global picture, but also in just sort of the peace and conflict space as well. I'm curious, Lisa, when you hear these findings about social cohesion, how do you think about that in terms of the relationship between social cohesion, peace, and resilience? And how does Mercy Corps kind of stitch together those concepts, social cohesion, peace, and resilience, in the conflict-affected places where you're working?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question, and really happy to be part of this discussion. And I see a lot of other experts in the virtual room, so really looking forward to the discussion after. Yeah, so I think that, what I really like about this study is that even though we've been evaluating our progress towards different aspects of social cohesion across our peace building programs for a while. This study helps give us some specific clues about how to build social cohesion within those distinct dimensions. And it tells us, what to look out for so we can better tailor our programming to unique contexts. And then when we zoom out to that broader question around, what is the relationship between social cohesion and our peace and resilience outcomes? And resilience itself is then related to a lot of other development outcomes. What we sort of take away from this in terms of the relationship between social cohesion and peace, as Ryan and Ife have said, different parts of social cohesion are or are not correlated to violence reduction or reduced support for violence. And it's important to note that because not all of them are, we have to be really careful to continue to not conflate social cohesion with peace. We see social cohesion as sort of a necessary but not sufficient intermediate outcome on the way to peace. And then in terms of resilience, we're patching together evidence across, from this study and a number of other studies. And one thing that's striking, and we already see from peace and other studies, is that different factors we normally associate with resilience writ large, like access to services that Ryan mentioned, that those are also associated with stronger social cohesion. So that gives us some clues around what some of those entry points might be for programming. And so kind of taking all of these experiences and evidence together, we've sort of recognized that these resilience and peace approaches are heavily interlinked and that social cohesion plays an important role in both. And I'll just pull out really quickly 3 kind of key takeaways that guide our work at this intersection. So the first is that, in our approach to building resilience and protracted crises or conflict-related crises, one of the 3 most important ingredients for success that we've identified is to intentionally pair short-term violence prevention with efforts to transform the kind of deeper structural drivers of conflict. And part of this is, I think, what we all know, that conflict, when it persists over several years, can really eat away at resilience capacities. And so within this sort of key takeaway, I think that social cohesion really sits as a bridge between short-term violence prevention on one hand, like strengthening conflict management systems, and then on the other hand, longer-term efforts to make systems level change. For example, on governance-related drivers of conflict. And I think the reason social cohesion is sort of that important middle point is that it helps those short-term gains in peace stick through enduring relationships. And it's also what helps communities and governments work together to tackle those underlying drivers. I think the second takeaway that sort of guides our work in this space is that we find that better social connections generally help communities to collaborate to build resilience. And for example, in past research in Ethiopia, we saw that stronger relationships between groups formerly in conflict helped communities to better withstand drought conditions and be more resilient to those shocks. And then a third and kind of final takeaway that's guiding us is that we've increasingly found it's important to find opportunities where our programming can accomplish 2 or more things at once when it comes to building peace and resilience. And I think the best example of this right now is climate security or climate and conflict. So we're trying to better hone our ability to support communities to become more climate resilient while also strengthening their social cohesion and reducing violence if possible. So Mali is a place where we are trying to go beyond that cooperative natural resource management, which is itself important, but also seeking to build those long-term resilience factors to future climate and conflict shocks. So there's a lot of ripe areas for this intersection.
Thanks, Lisa. You said a couple of things I'm going to put in my pocket for later. One is I like the idea of social cohesion as just kind of phrasing it as this necessary but insufficient, feature for peace. I find that super helpful. And then in terms of how it fits in with the short-term violence prevention versus long-term efforts, thinking of it as a bridge instead. I find that super, super useful. So thank you for that. We are going to go to Siaka next, and we are going to bring this back to Niger. And my question for Siaka is, we're actually going to get to challenges because we know this isn't easy and that this work is tough, and there's both challenges and then ways to try to address those. So Siaka, my question for you is, what are some of the specific challenges you're facing in your work to build social cohesion in Niger? And then what are some of the steps you all have been taking to try to work around those? Thanks. Oh, and we got you on mute again.
Thank you a lot for that. I think that in terms of the challenges that we face during the implementation of these peace programs, I would just like to take around maybe 3 or 4. The main one is, in fact, accessing the communities. In terms of social cohesion, and also in Africa, the face-to-face is really more effective, because if you can access to the community, that is somewhat difficult for you, in fact, to properly build these social cohesion activities. And also, sometimes we have a limited duration in the communities, meaning that you are in the community, you need, enough time, to be able to have this trust from the communities by interacting more with them. The second thing is, in fact, the participation of women. That was not easy because of the context of Niger, where, in fact, males are predominant in all the social constructions of these communities. So women participation was also a little bit challenging for us. And another thing that Rian talked about, the low presence of state. When you are in a community, our role is not to replace the state, but in fact to support the state in its vision. So to that extent, we need to have the state, to work closely with the state to ensure the sustainability of our actions. So we can be sure that after our action, we have someone to hand over to all these activities. And the last challenge that I would like to talk about is, in fact, our inability sometimes to meet the express basic needs of the communities. You go to a communities, we are talking about social cohesion, and they are telling you that we need water, we need food, we need this, and we need that. So which are not maybe planned in your project. So sometimes that have been very tricky for us, and for the specific case of these peace programs, where we know that in the Sahel, water is always, a center of conflict. That is known. So I think we are not able, in fact, to be able to respond to this water need. And in terms of mitigation measures that we have taken to be able to conduct this project and to achieve the result that we are presenting to you, is in fact the establishment within each community of what we call community action committees. These community action committees have been established by Mexico, taking into account these ethnical and social diversities, meaning that you have women in there, you have also this social group that we call caste, they are also in there. So that the community action committees are taken into account the real representation of the community. So they have been established by Mexico. And these are community action committee. So they are the one who are providing some good information to us, as we can't spend as much as time that we want in the communities. So through these community action committees, we are able to get relevant information that help us, to get the point of view of the communities, and also to plan with them, with the implication deeply into the project that we have planned to implement in the communities. And the second mitigation measure is, in fact, to build synergies. We know that we don't have all these activities planned in the project to meet the need of the communities. So we try to create some synergies, some partnership internally within Mexico. Just an example, if we are intervening in an area and we have these social cohesion activities, and population, they need a borehole, and if we have another program intervening in the same area, we can provide the borehole and help the community action, the social cohesion action to move forward. That is the kind of thing we're doing, and also trying to create some partnership with other NGOs, including also the state services, the local services of the state of Niger, to create this synergy so that we can respond to the need expressed by the communities. These have been key in achieving the result that we are presenting to you. Thank you.
Siaka, that was super helpful. I mean, on the one hand, thank you for being frank about the challenges, just what's kind of getting in your way and what that looks like. But then to hear about the community action committees and then trying to find those synergies. I know at USAID we're very interested in, but still working through ourselves what it looks like to be, working across humanitarian development piece, building coherence there, building portfolios. So we know that matters to meet folks' needs, and just hearing you reaffirm that is super helpful. Yeah, thank you for those thoughts. I am going to go back to Ife, and everyone should get their questions ready because I only have a couple more on my side, just flagging that for folks. So Ife, I was wondering, we heard from Lisa, which I thought was super helpful, that social cohesion is, necessary but insufficient for peace. And so I kind of wanted to turn to you for helping us frame how that puzzle piece fits in. What do you see the big picture role for social cohesion in reducing violence, and why is it so important for violence prevention, knowing it can't kind of save the day and solve everything, but what does that role look like? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jessie. So to understand that big picture perspective, I think it's very important to take a step back and to look at like a broader region, for instance, alongside some of the very unique institutional and even specific contexts that has been mentioned by Ryan, and by Siaka as well. So let's take a look, for instance, again at Africa and see how our analysis shows that in the region, in regions in Africa, rather, with more social cohesion, specifically, say, more contact with leaders, more trust, more civic engagement, there's less likelihood of some specific types of violent events occurring. We also find that in regions in Africa where there's higher perceptions of unfair ethnic treatment, there's less experienced violent events. And to even narrow it down a little and to move to another specific example, we see in findings from our research in Mali that there is a negative association between dimensions of social cohesion and incidences of violence, where those with higher social cohesion were less likely to have used violence, and we're also less likely to report like conflict occurred in their community. But apart from like specific violent events, we also have evidence that shows that dimensions of social cohesion are associated with less violent attitudes. So whether that's identity, like I mentioned earlier, or belonging, or whether it's tolerance, for instance, which is kind of a part of attitudes towards others, whereby the less prejudiced respondents were in our Afrobarometer analysis, the less likely they were to support violence or even participate in violence. And this aspect specifically about prejudice and tolerance of others is also consistent with some of our other research at Mercy Corps, which, such as again in Niger, which Ryan kind of mentioned, that shows that need to forge positive interactions between different social groups, not just to reduce negative stereotypes and discrimination against other groups, but to alter people's attitudes about violence. And then through qualitative research, again in Mali, we find that where there is little interaction among community members, cooperation and conflict management are even more challenging. And this is usually the case even among at-risk individuals. And to draw from another example from a Mercy Corps program, which is CREATE, where we find that people that engaged, or participants that engaged with people from different diverse backgrounds had less likelihood of supporting violence. And so for our analysis of participants in that program show how dimensions of cohesion that focus on interpersonal relationships amongst peers and across communities are strongly associated with reducing violent attitudes. And of course, we can't discount the role of trust in reducing violent norms and attitudes. And there's a significant link between trust and violent attitudes. And I think I mentioned that earlier as well. And to go back to our analysis of data from multiple African countries, we actually found very surprising nuances about trust among and within individuals, where trust in people that was strongly associated with less support for violence. Whereas just trusting people who generally had like a weak relationship with reduced support for violence. And so those are the kind of interesting nuances that are important to consider when looking at social cohesion and violence prevention generally. But likewise, and similarly in Mali, we find that greater interpersonal trust was also associated with lower levels of reported conflict in a community. And so this link between trust and reduced support for violence is not just limited to among individuals or within individuals. It also applies to vertical relationships between individuals and leaders, where we find that, more respondents, for instance, trusted leaders and institutions were less likely to support violence. And so these show how, and this kind of actually goes a little bit back to looking at those different dimensions and different components of social cohesion and how they affect violence or violent attitudes. And it also shows how these dimensions of social cohesion are or can be important when it comes to understanding the motivations for violent attitudes.
Thank you, Ife. That's super helpful. I would dig into it, but I'm being mindful of time, and I'm going to do two kind of rapid fire questions for Ryan and Lisa to help kind of wrap up this moderated panel in a bow, and then we get to all of your questions in the audience. So my question, and it's great to bring Ryan kind of like back onto the stage, so to speak. My question for Ryan is just, where are we going next with this research agenda? What do we still not know about social cohesion, especially in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, that we really ought to be figuring out? And where do you want to see this research agenda and this work going up ahead? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, the short answer is that we don't know a lot. And so I'll briefly highlight a set of 3 remaining evidence gaps in some of our ongoing efforts to fill them. So first, while the evidence that we presented today essentially provides a proof of concept for this idea of focusing on measuring the underlying dimensions of social cohesion, and for this idea that there can be tremendous variability across these dimensions within and between local contexts, we still don't know a lot about what these patterns look like in other contexts, both within Niger and more broadly. So as a result, there is a need, especially in the short run, for this kind of descriptive and diagnostic analysis, like what we presented in this study, and also like the results using the Afrobarometer data that Ife was discussing. And there is a special need to really focus in on understanding how these patterns of local variation vary across countries and across contexts that have different trajectories of fragility and conflict. The second big evidence gaps is about that central what works question in terms of the effectiveness of various programming approaches that attempt to strengthen social cohesion. There are special large gaps within this approach that we described here today, which take this more targeted approach at diagnosing patterns in social cohesion. And so there was a recent systematic review of impact evaluations on social cohesion published by 3IE. And this highlights a relatively small set of rigorous evaluations of a broad range of social cohesion interventions. Right, I think there were about 31 interventions in that set of rigorous evaluations. And that systematic review really highlights that these interventions had a relatively small and isolated effects on social cohesion. And the authors attribute this in part to a lack of programs that were explicitly designed using context-specific diagnostic assessments of social cohesion and conflict. And so the third publication within the Peace Research Agenda that I've mentioned a few times will help to fill this gap. But again, there's this need to really broaden the pipeline of rigorous evaluations. Within this, there's also a need to pay attention to the differential effects of interventions across gender lines, as suggested by some of our findings in the study and some of Siaka's remarks about these challenges really around gender sensitivity and gender inclusion within social cohesion programming in Niger. And then finally, and this is really germane to this discussion, the body of research and practice around these relationships between social cohesion, violent conflict, and resilience that Lisa was discussing are still just really emerging. And this is a question that our resilience colleagues at Mercy Corps kept asking as we were working on the brief that we presented today, and which we couldn't really answer because the PEACE program and its research agenda weren't totally set up for this. And as Lisa and Ife mentioned, we're starting to explore these a bit more deeply via research in a project in Mali that explicitly looks at this relationship between social cohesion, violence, and resilience in the context of a program that focuses on natural resource management. So I could go on, but those are three that come to mind.
No, that was perfect. I think that's a really nice note to end folks with, although they'll get to ask you more questions in a second. And then for Lisa, I have a similar question of where do you see, and take this in the direction that you want to, but basically on the programming side, where do you see programming around social cohesion heading in your work? And that can be from a global perspective, or whatever kind of you think is top of mind that's interesting to leave folks with in terms of like what's around the corner and what we're thinking about on the programming side. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So I think what I'm going to say sort of in some ways echoes what Ryan has outlined on the research side. So even though there's still a lot of questions around how to build social cohesion effectively and what it means for other outcomes, we feel like we're circling around the right process for how our teams should approach these questions and issues. And so we're in the process of finalizing a social cohesion toolkit that guides our teams through kind of a 3-step process. And the first is really understanding why we would want to build social cohesion in a specific context, and not just taking that for granted, because we see sort of social cohesion as a term being thrown about in a lot of different program, calls for proposals and proposals themselves. And so we want to be really intentional. Is it for a resilience related outcome, for example, increased food security in the face of shocks and stresses? Is it for a peace related outcome, et cetera? And so once teams have decided that, the next step then is to zero in, like Ryan and Siaka and Ife have all been saying, to zero in on that specific aspect or aspects of social cohesion that's most important, based on a context specific assessment. And then the third part is identifying how we will measure both the changes in social cohesion and links to bigger outcomes. And so kind of right now from a technical perspective, once, working through those processes, our toolkit circles on 4 kind of main approaches to building social cohesion. One is similar to the PEACE model, so improving relationships and trust between communities through convening and joint projects. The second is improved resource management, so facilitating positive interactions to help communities cooperate around a driver of conflict. The third is increasing inclusion of marginalized groups, like we've been talking about. And then finally, there's improving relationships between communities and governments. So really focusing on that vertical component. And we see as a sort of complement to these approaches is improved conflict management mechanisms and capacity, because we think that pairs really well. And Ryan mentioned this with kind of strengthened social cohesion. And so that's sort of the framework. And just to leave with one quick example, one program that I think represents sort of our best thinking to date of how these elements all fit together is a new program in DRC. And I saw a question about DRC in the chat as well. This program is USAID funded. It's called Partnership for the Development of Eastern Congo. And it has 3 interlinked outcomes, and those are increased resilience to conflicts and crises, more accountable, trusted, and responsive institutions, and then finally, inclusive and diversified economic growth. That specifically improves stability. And so this program is in the early days, but what we'll be doing as we move forward is really teasing out a learning agenda that allows us to identify those links across the outcomes, but also to measure how social cohesion impacts all 3 of those main objectives. So yeah, I'll end it there. Looking forward to questions and comments.
Awesome. Yeah, Lisa, thank you so much for that. And I have a pretty good list of questions here, so I am gonna dive in. Now, my first one is from DeBerry. It was closer to the top of the presentation that we had today. And so DeBerry's question is about what are the major challenges for humanitarian development actors facing during these kinds of interventions? We did ask Siaka about that, but I'm curious if anyone else wants to chime in quickly about any key challenges that maybe, because Siaka, you gave a super pithy, brief answer, but feel free to chime in if there's anything that you felt like you didn't get to share on the challenges side, and then others feel free to chime in too if something's top of mind. Over.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that I would like to add to what I already said, that in terms of challenges for development is in fact this kind of collaboration. And I think that with this result of these peace programs, so we have a kind of a roadmap, to know where to start, because the context of the Sahel right now imposed us to take into account this social cohesion aspect, and also to look for synergies, because we can't do alone everything, to respond to the community's needs. So this collaboration is key now, taking into account of this preliminary result that we have in this peace program. I think that is very key, to try, in fact, to know our value added. Mexico, we know very well our value added. And with this peace program, we are adding another value added in terms of the vision of the nexus. The nexus that suppose really a strong collaboration, strong integration, strong layering, sequencing when possible. So these are, in fact, these challenges I'm seeing right now. When I look at all the development actors, everyone is trying to say, okay, I'm doing this, but they are not looking for these synergies, So going together, because the situation impacts all of us, and we need to be together to be stronger. Thank you.
Thanks for driving that home, Siaka. Both because you shared it as something that you're really searching and seeking for in your own work, which is wonderful, but just to acknowledge that it's tough, big picture. Yeah, thank you. And so my next question, I'm trying to decide who to give it to. So Anthony is asking about social cohesion kind of in the context of how this can take years, decades, generations, et cetera, to get maybe the kind of social cohesion outcome, ideal end state we'd all like to dream about. And so Anthony's question is, and also our programming is normally short term, and I'm not sure if Anthony is on the HA side or if it's still just short term, because even a 2 to 3 year development program is super short in the grand scheme of life. So Anthony's question is, in your experience, can short-term program activities move the needle and strengthen social cohesion in these kind of thorny contexts where we know that grievances are high, trust is low, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm curious, I'll add a little, is there anything you've seen that's promising? I know we don't want to get too much into magic bullets. I feel like the whole presentation was about local context, variation in so many forms, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm curious if anything seems more promising than others in short-term programming for strengthening social cohesion along certain features. And I might turn to Ryan for this, just on the evidence side, but then open it up to other folks to add in there too.
Thanks. I was going to raise my virtual hand, so I think you targeted it in the right way. It's a great question, Anthony, and it's something that we've thought a lot about. And I will say that I don't have a firm answer. This is actually another area where there are major evidence gaps. But I think how we're thinking about this is both from measurement and programming, starting from the bottom up. And I think something that helps us is, even though social cohesion writ large, as Anthony says, is this large, overarching, slow-moving thing, by moving from the bottom up and really thinking about, in a really specific way, the specific behaviors, norms, and attitudes that contribute to social cohesion, that is something that we can start moving at the level of programs, and something that we can start measuring. And there is broader evidence on social norm change shows that this can happen quite quickly, right? That there are moments of cascading shifts in social norms. And so that gives us hope, but it's still not necessarily easy or clear. So I do think, I think, and I'll then hand over to my colleagues and co-panelists, but I do think that rather than a silver bullet, I will always resist silver bullet questions. I won't take the bait. I do think what it shows is a need to think about how we expand the timescales of programming windows and the scopes to really think, and this builds exactly what Antiako was just saying, around integration across programming approaches and really careful layering over larger spans of time, and thinking about, at the level of policy, right? This is part of what makes the Global Fragility Act as a framework for really thinking about how we do and how we invest in conflict prevention and violence prevention so important, because it starts to really think about integration both across small projects, but larger scale diplomacy and investment. And I think that is really how we might get to this movement from really the bottom up approach to shifting the really fundamentals of social cohesion into really moving the needle on this big picture over larger stretches of time.
I'm on mute, gosh. Anyway, Ryan, thank you for that. And I had a quick follow-up, which is, can you give an example of social norm change for the audience? Just a quick example or two of what that might look like in programming.
It's interesting. I think my biggest example of widespread social norm change, thinking about home, is something that's happened in our lifetime in the United States, is changes of social norms around littering, right? And I mean, it's a very different, but there are moments of, for me, I grew up in the 1980s, and there was a moment of shift where littering was not viewed as bad behavior and was quite prominent, and through a combination of messaging and mobilization by environmental groups as well as government actors, right, really led to a really big shift in what was both common practice and what was good behavior. And again, that's one that's just looking at home. I feel like my colleagues will be able to think of other examples from our programming work and from our context, but that's one of the biggest, just to really concretize what a social norm is and how it can change, one that really pops up into my head.
I'm wondering, so we do have a bunch of questions, so I want to let folks chime in, but if you don't have anything super burning, I might move on to our next person. And we do have a hand raised, so I'm going to jump the queue. So basically, if you raise your hand, you get to cut in line. That's how this Q&A works. And Jennifer Karsner. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn to you. I know you have a couple comments in the chat and a question. I can read the comments, but also I just want to free you up to share what you'd like to share, and then ask the question you'd like to ask. So over to you.
Yeah, I guess what this argues for from USAID is maybe more time and attention to ethnographic research to understand the intricacies of social dynamics and trust dynamics and relationships that are at the village level, because we saw when I was there that the relationship between the Hausa and the Zarma and the Pul were often on the outskirts of the village, but one of the strongest drivers of social cohesion between Pul and Hausa and Zarma, depending on the village it was the livestock sharing arrangement, where the Pul would take the Hausa or Zarma livestock, and they would get to keep either the milk or an offspring. But what that did was that very strong relationship between those two ethnic groups made them highly resistant to anti-Pul sentiment. And so the villages where those relationships remained strong were less likely to be violent against the Pul when the violent extremist organizations in the north were deliberately spreading anti-Pul sentiment. And what we found was that over 10 years or so, that relationship had been monetized, and that had weakened those social ties. And so I think understanding like those kind of dynamics is really important, because those dynamics, if you're a resilience program working on livestock, right, they're very, very easy to strengthen with very little addition, I mean, and it's also, we found that women also had those arrangements. So it's also a venue to strengthen women's participation in livestock. But those kind of, paying that kind of attention to those social dynamics, if your resilience program, leads to really significant benefits in sustainability of the project, as well as resistance to the violent extremist messages. And so, you know, for us, it means, if we're going to expand that kind of learning, it means taking the time to really find out what those kind of social dynamics are at the village level where we're programming. And so for me, it's like an argument for additional ethnographic research. The question I would have is shifting. We're also seeing some different results from psychosocial and trauma healing, community trauma healing approaches have some pretty significant benefits in East Africa. And so I was curious if you guys have done work on that, or if you've seen any of those community trauma healing approaches being used in West Africa. So that's where I'd go with that one. Over.
And I might go to Ife and Siaka. I might go to you on the psychosocial part, and then open it up depending on if others want to chime in too.
Okay, I was waiting to see if Siaka wanted to go first. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. So absolutely agree. Actually, just going a little bit back to Jennifer's comment about ethnographic research. I'll even go further to say it's also one of the benefits, I think, of diverse methodologies and diverse research methods, really, when it comes to evaluating, but also understanding some of these complex dynamics that we have been talking about all morning. And some of, I think, even throughout our conversation, I think you see that we alluded a little bit to some qualitative data collection, some quantitative, some survey as well. I think those also help to help us to better understand these dynamics. As far as psychosocial and community healing, I will say that actually an example that comes to mind really is from East Africa as well. I am thinking of our CREATE program. I mentioned it earlier as well, where we looked at the role of social and economic interventions when it comes to reducing vulnerability amongst risk individuals. And part of the interventions and part of the programs looked at community healing, looked at mentorship, looked at trauma healing as well as and counseling. And I will say that part of our goal with that program was understanding how these interventions and the role that they played in reducing the vulnerability amongst the participants of the program. And we actually find that, even though I have to preface that by saying that we cannot basically assert causality because of the design of the research, but we can say that we found that people and participants who were a part of the interventions were part of these group of activities, and I'm not remembering all of them off the top of my head, but who were part of these activities after the intervention were less likely to be vulnerable to violent extremism from the proxy that we use, which is support for violence, participation in violence, justification in violence. And we also found that, because part of what we're also measuring was some of these components and dimensions of social cohesion that we've been talking about. So interactions with diverse networks, and civic engagement and participation, trust in leaders, trust in others. And we also saw some increase in these measures after the interventions have taken place. So yeah, absolutely. I will say that those are part of our programs, and we also see some influence of such programs on social cohesion, but also on violent behaviors.
Ife, thanks so much for that. Oh, wait, Siaka, is that you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much. I just would like to add to that. Thank you, Jennifer, for this information on the social dynamic. I think that, the peace program, it is in fact a starting point for us, because all these social dynamic, we need to really take them into account in this context that we have right now, You know, in West Africa, we have what we call a cousin jockey. That means that you did, okay, someone is my slave, the other one is my slave. So all these things, we have to take that into account to see in what extent they can, in fact, facilitate the relationship between people. Because, just an example, I'm a Bobo, and you have some Pearl in West Africa, wherever he come from, Burkina, Niger, Mali, and so on. As soon as he told me that he's a Fulani and I'm a Bobo, so, you know, we have this systematic relationship. I think these are some kind of dynamic that we need in this context that we are right now to try to add value to that, and that can help us, in fact, to better build our social cohesion. So I totally agree that we need also to go further, because of that studies, ethnographic studies, had been done a while ago, but I think it's good, I think, to update it, and that can be really very helpful for everyone. Thank you.
Siaka, thanks so much for that. And I wanted to let Ryan get in because he wanted to follow up on Jennifer's general point about how important ethnography is, and I'll just give it a here as well while I'm talking. So I want to go over to Ryan for that, and then to just foreshadow our next 9 minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze in 1 to 2 more questions. We can see they'd have to be a little more rapid fire, and then we will be saying goodbye. So just FYI. So Ryan, over to you.
Thanks. And I want to just underline the bit of fist pump and dancing that I did when Jennifer mentioned ethnography, and also highlight where the challenges or innovations may need to be in making good on that. So thinking about some of the challenges in the context that Siaka mentioned, something that we faced within the research in peace is the security context locally made that type of long stays in villages and kind of that in-depth ethnography really challenging. And while we were able to get some qualitative snippets, it definitely doesn't rise to that level of in-depth social observation. And so there needs to be innovations either pushing into methods around rapid ethnography that have been used in other contexts in West Africa and Sierra Leone, or really also thinking about participatory research and thinking about communities as partners in designing and implementing research. And that's things that we've worked on, some of that within elsewhere in West Africa, in Nigeria, in another USAID funded program. So I think I underline and fist pump, and that means there's that need for investing in how we do that in these contexts of conflict and fragility.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. And I just wanted to read out something that played out in the chat. So Garrett asked about good examples for social cohesion measurement indicators, and Ryan replied in the chat, but just wanted to flag for other folks that there is, Mercy Corps has worked with the World Bank's CDD Global Practice to produce a social cohesion measurement toolkit. So that's something that's available, and the link is in the chat. And I'm gonna try to get to Wendy's question, which I think is very interesting. I'm curious what a lot of folks think about it. Wendy's asking, can the panelists speak to the role of justice, either specifically for promoting social cohesion or more broadly for social cohesion plus peace and resilience? Several panelists have hinted at it, and I think that's something I'm interested in too, because when we hear about collective action, trust going on at the community level, yeah, I think it does raise questions about what was that kind of like, what do justice mechanisms look like at the local level, and how does that intersect? So I might go to Ife first for this on the research side, and then open it up to the rest of the crew. So Ife, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to take that, so I'm glad you called it me. I will say that the idea of justice, or perception of justice, or perception of treatment from the government really relates to the role of identities, which we've mentioned a lot today. So for instance, earlier on, I mentioned that, attachment to specific identities can influence attitudes and behavior that are related to violence. And so we found that if you identify with your ethnic group instead of your nationality, it's associated with greater support for violence. But the really interesting ones there is that those that those that are really attached to their ethnic groups, if they perceive unfair treatment from the government, if they perceive, to use Wendy's term, injustice from the government, then that sort of influence of their attachment to the identity, to their ethnic identity, is even more pronounced on their support for violence. And so this perception of unfair ethnic treatment of your ethnic group by the government really strengthens that relationship between ethnic identity and violent attitudes. And I think that it also really underscores that importance of fair treatment of all groups, especially subnational groups. And it shows, again, I think there's a lot of conversation about cohesion within and amongst groups, but this, I believe, underscores that important role for leaders and authorities in the goal towards violence prevention and peace. And it really also is consistent, that finding is consistent with a lot of the previous research that have shown how horizontal inequalities, that have shown that link rather between horizontal inequalities and violent mobilization. And even if you move away a little bit from Africa as well, and look at our study, for instance, our study really in Iraq, showing how those that were more attached to their Yazidi identity supported the use of violence, as opposed to those that were more attached to the Iraqi identity, which again shows the influence or the importance of subnational identities, but also that significance of fair treatment and equal treatment of all groups by authorities, by leaders, and by the government.
Ife, thanks. That was super helpful. I want to give anyone a chance. We've got a few minutes left. Does anyone want to chime in on that question? And then otherwise, we will wrap up.
Yes, I think that for the peace program, of the fact that we established peace community action committees, it was in fact a way to reduce a little bit this justice issues. Because when you go to the community and you ask for the lead of the youth, yes, oh, here it is. But when you look at it, is in fact the cousin of or the nephews of the chief of the village. When you say that, okay, I want to talk to the head of women groups, so it is maybe the second wife or the third wife of the chief of villages. So, you know, in that way, transparency is a little bit difficult. You know, that's why these community action committees that we set up, that take into account all this ethnical diversity and also these social groups, the diversity in the communities. So that helps us at least to be more transparent and also to reduce some injustice. Thank you.
Siaka, thanks so much for that. And everyone, that is going to conclude our time together. Thank you so much, everyone, but both the audience and our speakers. I'm just very grateful. We had a really great, set of questions and a really great conversation. So thank you to everyone. I do want to flag, great, and we have a slide up on this, that this is part of a discussion series. So we had the first one, which you can find the recording for back in November. And then coming up in January, please stay tuned for the final in this discussion series on resilience and protracted crises with the case study of Northeast Nigeria. We are just super grateful to everyone here, Ryan for the presentation, Ife, Siaka, Lisa, and everyone, for your remarks. This was just super interesting. And I look forward to the conversation continuing. And yeah, thank you again. Thank you to the audience for your great questions. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for joining us. And please stay tuned for the invite for the January session too. Bye, everyone.